Hello. I've been putting off doing this, but I'm just going to do it here and now. So, what I'm going to begin today is probably the final playlist for YouTube, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. And it's a playlist looking at the historical context for Brexit, and looking at the historical context for the crisis that we are in as a country in the UK, because we're in a very, very serious and perilous situation at the moment, and we're working blind. Now, in the other playlists I did, I talked very much about the evolution of the rule of law, I talked about changing family structures, I talked about the emergence of new aspects of the economy, and we looked at how TERF was the product of a belief system in crisis and the culture who construct that belief system. So we found that TERF, we used it like a torch, and it highlighted institutions where they were not aware of this rule of law. And that was very, very effective. But the playlist that I did not do was the playlist about historical context. Now, partly that was because I had to get quite a lot online in a short space of time before the ever predictable thing happened that ended up happening to me, and then some. And I had to get it all online before I did that, and I wanted to get it online before this crisis reached this point. But now this crisis has reached this point, and we have passed the first deadline for Brexit. I thought it might be worth looking at how I know some things, because I think people think I'm a witch, and I'm really not. Do you know what I mean? I know some things for perfectly rational reasons. So my concern is social policy systems. And my concern is the intersection between local authorities and centrally planned cash transfer systems, and the way that they join together around people. Now, in order to understand these systems, you have to understand that these are systems which are very much shaped by instability and power relations. So our local authorities are shaped by the development in the rule of law around abuse and care, and all these things that we would rather not look at as a society, but that we do because we're a modern, mature, functioning democracy, and we have the rule of law covering vulnerable people. And I went over that playlist, and I outlined what that rule of law looked like. So our local authorities emerge from domestic instability, but in a very managed way, because we're a mature and stable country. Now, the bigger concern to me was the realization that we were at the point where our centrally planned systems would redefine. Now, our benefit system is something different. Now, social welfare systems, centrally planned social welfare systems, the ones that Hayek were concerned about and the ones that Beveridge was concerned about, they do not emerge because of minor things. So they are always the product of major crisis. So in this country, we understand that our welfare system came into being as World War II ended. And we know that, welfare systems across Europe and the development of welfare states within World War II was very much a race and a propaganda thing to try and keep the war effort up. They thought we'd stop chucking our kids into the blender of this war if our veterans were going to come home to nothing the way they did with World War I. And this is where the rule of law has evolved from. But these institutions are intrinsically linked to very serious instability, often international instability, and they are often about trying to maintain domestic tensions against massive instability internationally. So I haven't mentioned, but I'm going to be finishing studying in Berlin, and one of the benefits of Berlin is that they're an order liberal country and not a neoliberal country, and all that really means is that the lessons they learn are very, very different to the ones that we learn. And so, in Germany, they understand completely that social welfare systems were not a gift from a benevolent, left-wing someone who wanted to better the poor, because they understand that the father of modern welfare states in Europe is Otto von Bismarck, and he was a very, very staunch social conservative and a monarchist. And to him, what the social welfare system that he came up with was about pragmatism, about managing the power dynamics which threatened, some very serious consequences. And this was in a Europe where, monarchy was ending, where there were revolutions threatened, where there was gross instability. And it's actually, Kaiser Wilhelm, who Otto von Bismarck, that was kind of his weakest link, really. The welfare system that Bismarck came up with was one of the greatest developments in European stability, and it was actually his kind of blindness to Kaiser Wilhelm. And you have to understand, that this was about political tensions. And so when you undermine the rule of law with your welfare system, which is what we've just done because of a reliance on theoretical economics that cannot see these things, you cause instability. And in Germany, obviously, they already know very, very deeply, at the core of everything that they are, the damage that centrally planned systems can do when they undermine the rule of law, especially when that rule of law is around marginalised groups. And, they have a terrible kind of history that they have had to reconcile themselves with as a country. So they have never really... So while we haven't really learnt those lessons here, we have learnt those lessons, and we do know these things. But in England at present, we use a theoretical economics which is kind of bunk, which relies on a media landscape which doesn't exist. And you can kind of see that on Twitter. Our political media have been locked in that abusive circle with the narcissistic reflex that was demonstrated even in the social movement around, the system, the rule of law that I'm discussing. Even in an actual movement about those systems, the political spectrum would reproduce, the subordination of that discussion would reproduce, and, they're all caught in those circles on Twitter. So what I wanted to do with this playlist was I wanted to look at historical context. And it wasn't just about our welfare systems. Brexit has now metastasized so that we are in a very serious situation. We have, very much our international relationships are in flux, shall we say. And England has lost the power to have its behaviour remain unspoken. And our understanding of history is about to adjust very, very, very quickly and broaden. We are going to develop a sense of ourselves as a country within an international framework. And we have never done this, because we have always been top-tier players and we've just booted ourselves off the top tier. So now we have to understand the world that we live in. And I thought that now might be a time to look at the historical context. And it's not like there's a version of history that you can just refer to. You can't just go, oh, this date, this date, this date, because history is about reviewing evidence and telling ourselves a story. So what I wanted to use this playlist for, it's not like a history lesson. Although any of the periods that I talk about, really go ahead and read, and I'll put as much reading as I can up. But what I wanted to show you was my particular interest is periods of crisis and continuity, where our belief system changes. So the narrative that I have about history is very much shaped by that. The history is about, even if you are the greatest historian in the world, nobody has more than a fragmentary understanding of history. History is about the stories that we tell ourselves. And it's those stories that are going to change quite dramatically in this country over the next couple of years, because they're going to be forced to. And so with history, we review it with every generation. We review evidence in the light of what we now know, in the light of the way we see the world now, and then we look at history and we go, oh my God, we do as if we did that. And we review it with every generation. And that's very much happening at the moment. And I wanted to kind of talk us through that process. But I think before I begin to go, I'll outline what I'm going to look at for the rest of this playlist. You have to be careful with history, because misreading history has caused a lot of problems. And if you read Tacitus on Germany, you'll find some really alarming lines, that you hear. You see echoes of the most terrible things in history from misinterpretation of these lines. All reviewing of history ever is you telling a story to yourself. So what you're getting is a story that's shaped by your own perception, your own feelings, your own identity. So what I'm going to share with you is the way that I use history. So this is not a true version of history, it's not a history textbook, but I use a historical framework. In fact, I use several historical frameworks. Now, what I'm always looking to history for is to inform the present. And if you look at the research agendas within history as an academic discipline, you'll find that it pretty much always reflects modern preoccupations. So you'll find that Charlemagne's a good example of this. When the European Union was being formed, everybody was looking at Charlemagne in that way, and then, you know, as we experience different crises, we tend to look through history for precedents for that crisis. You'll hear people say this is like the 30s. I look for periods where power dynamics are exposed and belief systems are in flux. So within this video, within this playlist, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it over a series of videos. I'm not even sure how many it'll take. But I'm going to look at some of the kind of parameters that I put on history to allow myself to see things. So I often use the post-war settlement because all the institutions that I'm concerned with were born in 1945. So that it allows me to look at a cycle. I use the 10th century because that's a very important turning point for Western Europe. And what I'm actually going to use in these videos is the transformation of the Roman Empire as the starting point. And then that should allow us to look at all the different belief systems that have emerged then, actually at the point where they were emerging. So we're going to look at Christianity, we're going to look at Islam, we're going to look at the nations of Europe, we're going to look at the Islamic Empire, we're going to look at the Byzantine Empire, and we're going to look at the emergence of national and supranational relations in Europe. And we're going to look at the transformation of the Roman Empire in terms of the components of our belief system, which are up for grabs now. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to look at the Roman Empire and the transformation of the Roman Empire is part of a multipolar world. So I'm also going to look at the way that China, as a very serious power at this point, impacted the end of the Roman Empire and how this impacted the East. Now, this is not perfect. Nobody can look over thousands of years of history and come up with a perfect view. But what I want to show you over the course of this playlist is how periods of crisis and continuity work, and I want to look at different periods where our belief system has been in flux to see if we can gain insight into the crisis that's happening now around us. Because the UK is in a very, very serious crisis. We have just threatened the 27-country bloc next door. The stable relationships between the US and the EU, which has kept us stable for 70 years, is now in flux. And even if we had a functioning government and a functioning opposition, that would be almost impossible to get through. And we don't have a functioning government, and we don't have a functioning opposition. And instead we've got that shit show on Twitter. So we're going to look at the historical context that shit show on Twitter can't see. I'm probably going to do them all as a one-er. I'm probably not going to do them tonight. And I'm going to upload probably a video every 2 days, 10 minutes of video, the way that I did it before. And we'll see how that goes. Okay?